That night, the news blared, and the room went cold the moment my family's laughter faded into silence. They weren't laughing at a company collapse. They were laughing at me. "A joke," my father said, voice flat as a coffee spill. "An embarrassment to this family." My sister's eyes widened, then shut, as if to trap the ember of their scorn inside her chest. My mother pressed her hands to her mouth, as if she could swallow the future and spit out the shame. I stood there in the glow of the television, the floor cold under my shoes, and I realized something brutal. Betrayal isn't a one-time sting. It's a gravity that can pull you down or force you to grow roots deep enough to lift an entire city. The hook wasn't the failure. It was the certainty that I would never let that room or that word define me again. I walked out with the taste of fake sugar in my mouth and a vow in my ribs. Prove them wrong, not by shouting back, but by building something that no one could deny. I didn't know then how long the climb would be, or how many nights I'd sleep folded over a notebook in a borrowed apartment with the smell of damp soil in my lungs. But I did know the direction, away from the noise, toward the living world below our sidewalks, the invisible networks of mycology. The fungi that could turn poisoned soil into a chorus of green. Painful departure and relentless pursuit. They had dismissed it as a hobby, a joke, a pastime for eccentric gardeners. Environmental bioremediation by fungi, urban mycology, felt to them like a rumor you'd whisper to a child to make them sleep. Unbelievable, childish, unmarketable. I left so many doors behind that night, I could hear the hinges sobbing. But I walked toward a different kind of door, the one that opened into the ground, where decay waited with a patient hand and offered a lesson if you were listening. The early days were solitary, almost medieval in their solitude. I rented a tiny basement for a lab and spent days coaxing fungal communities to colonize contaminated soils, testing species that could pull heavy metals from brick and asphalt prisons. People called it a fad. The financial world called it a risk. The skeptics, neighbors, old colleagues, even a few family friends called it a wasted chance. The ridicule followed me like a second skin. "If you're serious," a former investor sneered, "you'd be serious about a real job." I learned to listen to the soil more than to the sound of my own heartbeat. Then the work began to answer the doubters. In a derelict lot on the edge of a hospital district, I coaxed a web of fungi to weave through the cracked pavement, to reach down into the toxins and refuse. Small wins, pocket-sized patches of green, a drop in the bucket of the city's needs, became stubborn things. Numbers on a chart that told a different story than the one spoken at the kitchen table. Mycology grew into a method. Remediation grew into a mission. I learned to translate the language of spores into something people could believe in, something they could touch. And slowly, the world started listening. The corporate betrayal that had crushed my first startup loomed over every step I took, like a shadow with an agenda. A partner had realigned revenues, siphoned IP, pulled the plug when the road got rough, and left me with the wreckage and a courtroom bill I could barely read through the tears. They thought they'd buried me. They didn't realize they'd lit a fire that refused to be regulated by their boardrooms. I learned to pivot not away from the betrayal, but through it, using their own fear of loss to pull me toward a future they couldn't see. Arduous ascension and profound triumph. Cities are slow learners, and they carry the scars of neglect like a tattered coat you keep telling yourself you'll mend. But with every project, the stories changed. A brownfield tucked behind a bus depot sprouted into a living corridor of shade and scent. A polluted riverbank breathed again, its banks threaded with reed beds and mushrooms that pulsed with life like a heartbeat under moss. The skeptics, the municipal officials who once doubted an eccentric gardener, began to call themselves students of the living world. I learned to speak in the language of ecosystems, the way a single mushroom can detoxify a hectare of city ground, the way root networks distribute nutrients like shared wealth, the way a city can be fed by the quiet, patient work of unseen fungi. The triumph didn't arrive as a single thunderclap. It arrived as 1,000 small, stubborn lights. The first community garden whose soil finally tested clean. An elementary school that planted mushrooms in a science project and watched them grow into a demonstration that a future could be rewritten. An old factory site turned into a green spine that stitched the city together with a living ribbon of soil, roots, and air. Each success was a page in a ledger I never meant to keep. Yet the balance kept tipping towards something bigger than myself. And when the inevitable corporate shadows returned, for a new investor's pitch, a renewed interest in IP, I faced them with something sharper, a living proof of concept, a field-ready system, a city that could be remediated and restored by the patient, stubborn work of fungi. The ridicule of the past became wind in my sails. The same people who had called me ridiculous now watched as the air tasted cleaner, as playgrounds sprouted among formerly toxic fields, as rooftops wore green like a crown. I didn't just prove them wrong, I proved that trust is a living thing, built with soil and water and time, not with the loud words of those who fear their own obsolescence. Cathartic return and poetic justice. Then came the day I returned home. With 1,000 photos in my pockets and a field report that could outlive us all. I stood at the edge of the town's oldest square, the kind of place where you hear the rumor of itself and feel it in your bones. The family had agreed to come, not for a party, but for a demonstration, the kind that makes the earth hum. The town had brought out a crowd, and I led them to a site that used to smell of oil and rust. The air was different there, cooler and sweeter, carrying the faint tang of mushroom earth and rain. When I slid back the tarp over the new bioremediation bed, the transformation leapt at them in one breath. A cracked concrete plaza melted into a soft, living carpet. Ferns and grasses marched across a strip where there used to be only dust. A stream reappeared where seepage had choked the ground with chemicals. Children ran across a patch of mushrooms, like stepping stones to a better century. Elders stood with their hands on the rough wooden rails and whispered, almost to themselves, about the old days when nothing grew here except grit. My father, who had labeled me a joke with such force it almost sounded like mercy, stood before the greenery with his mouth open, a man who finally met the proof of his own fear, that he had risked his name for something hollow and ended up denying the life inside him that wanted to believe. My mother, eyes glistening, reached out as if to touch the first leaf that had found its way into our town's memory. My sister, once a skeptic of every mushroom I touched, held her breath as a tiny mushroom unfurled on the edge of the green carpet, and something in her softened. And I spoke, not to scold, not to gloat, but to tell the truth of what had happened inside me. I had chosen a future that would not let them forget the power of a single spore when given time, care, and faith. The scene shifted from spectacle to accountability. I asked them to walk the site with me, to feel the change in the air, to listen to the city breathe again. They asked me how I could be so sure after decades of being shown nothing but failure. I did not answer with bravado. I offered them a ledger, the karma's ledger the city itself kept, recording the day's work, the nights of doubt turned into dawns of proof, the communities served, the toxins removed, the lives improved. It was simple. The energy I had poured into proving them wrong was the energy that remade our home. The consequences of their derision? They faced the reality that their ridicule did not cage a dream. It gave it the gravity to grow, to reach, to heal. The city's children no longer ran away from danger. They ran toward a forest that stood where once a corporation had thought to bury a problem. The family learned in that moment what it means to watch a dream become a legacy, and to realize that the ledger was never against them, but through them. A reminder that bile can become the soil from which a better future takes root. We stood there as the sun spilled gold across the green, and the crowd erupted into a chorus of applause and fresh curiosity. I looked at my parents, at my sister, at the townspeople, at everyone who had ever doubted, and I saw fear melt into something else. Awe, and then responsibility. I spoke softly, a reckoning and a gift all at once. I told them that the dream had never been just about saving soil or cleaning rivers. It had been about earning our right to belong to the future, about choosing to be useful to more than ourselves. If the land could forgive us, perhaps we could do the same for each other. The ending wasn't loud. It was quiet and intimate, a quiet victory with a chorus of feet on moss and the gentle rustle of leaves. I had gone away to prove I mattered. I stayed to remind my family that matter, true matter, is more stubborn than fear. The city, the soil, and the spores all gave testimony, and I, once mocked for a dream deemed ridiculous, stood as a keeper of a new ledger, where every line is a life reclaimed, every sum a breath of air back into a world that had forgotten how to breathe. Karma isn't a courtroom, it's a garden. You plant, you wait, and you grow something you can share with the world. I did that. They witnessed it. They finally understood that the best revenge isn't scorched earth, but the emergence of life from the darkest corners. And in that understanding, we all found something unexpected, a future we wanted to live in, together.